Hello and welcome to a brand new feature we're introducing to Crash.net and our YouTube channel, a brand new podcast or vlog, or maybe it's TikTok, I don't know, I'm not quite sure what TikTok is yet, but I'm Ollie Barstow, and joining me for our premiere today are two of my very good friends, very learned, very experienced friends, Julianne Cerasoli, one of Brazil's foremost F1 radio, web, and if she's paid enough, that's her words, TV reporter, and Leigh O'Gorman, who's a journalist and researcher from the Motorsport Archive, and you definitely want them in your pub quiz team. Now, before we get underway, we want to make this a regular feature for you, which means we want you to let us know what you're thinking, what you'd like us to discuss with the benefit of our insider knowledge, or simply if you like or dislike what we're wearing. It's entirely up to you, but try and keep it on the motorsport. Either way, don't forget to like and subscribe, which is, I think, somewhere down here. We haven't quite worked it out yet, but somewhere around here. And because it's the first time we've done this, we thought we'd save it for a really, really good big news day, which thank you, Fernando Alonso, for saving your best until today for us. Obviously, the big news today, Fernando Alonso will return to Formula One next year with Renault. And, being serious, the rumours of him returning to F1 never really went away after 2018. We all thought he'd come back, but it has come together pretty quickly, squeezed between these first two races. So just a bit of reaction on that first. I'll come to you ladies first. Julianne, do you want to go first?
Yeah, do you think it's weird that everything happened so fast, especially after what we've seen from Ferrari in the first race? And I'm going to explain myself. Vettel was not really happy with his situation. And a lot of people who had talked to him could see that maybe he won't finish the season. And then we can start thinking, oh, maybe Vettel is leaving and then Carlos will go to Ferrari and of course, Daniel will go to McLaren and then that seat is empty. Because if you think throughout all these teams, Ferrari would love to have Carlos as soon as they can. The same with McLaren, with Daniel, and the same with Renault. So that's what I thought it was a bit strange because it was quite quick, as you said, and there's no reason why, unless they need a backup plan, just in case Vettel doesn't end the season at Ferrari, something that has happened with a world champion before.
So you think this could be the start of something completely different this year, in the sense of, like, you think a bit of a domino will fall and the rest will ultimately follow, and it could all be, Fernando could even be in the seat by the end of this year?
At least just having this plan B already set. I'm not saying this is going to happen at all, but because Seb was so unhappy, we didn't know because he hadn't spoken to the press before, but what we've seen, although we are working from home, but what we've seen in Austria is that he's really, really hurt in this situation. The relationship inside Ferrari is really bad. It's worse than we thought, and that's why you need to have a plan B. Formula One, they're always thinking forwards. They're never thinking about next week or next race. They're thinking maybe in November the team will be different. And that's why I think the plan B is already in place with Fernando there. Fernando was going to be there anyway. It's very good for Fernando. I'm not sure if it's very good, but that's what he wanted. It's very good for Renault, definitely. And then to move things quickly, I think there's a little bit of a plan B going on as well.
I think what's interesting, and Jules, you raised some really, really interesting points there about particularly about the future of Vettel. And I'm in the same situation. I've been working from home. It's been a while since I was last in the paddock. What I saw at the weekend was a Sebastian Vettel who is quite happy actually quite reminiscent of Damon Hill in 1999. He's had his fill and is quite ready to get to the end of the season and walk away from F1 and go into the sunset and never look back. And I think it's a very interesting point. Could things be set in motion earlier on? And it's quite conceivable. It is very, very possible. What I find really interesting is all this news with Sainz, with Vettel, with Ricciardo, all came out very, very early on in May. And I know there was some comments about it coming very, very quickly together. And I'm actually just curious. I wonder if this is something that's actually been in play for quite a while. And Renault have just been quite comfortable to sit on the news, not really make any big waves, not make any big movements. And I think it's actually kind of clever because they have effectively owned the news day. I mean, not even just today. But there were all the rumors yesterday were circulating. Even on Monday, the Spanish media were already releasing reports that this is going to be announced on Wednesday morning. So effectively, Renault, following the Grand Prix at the weekend, Renault have effectively covered the news agenda for this entire week. And I think that's worked out very, very well for them. So I don't necessarily think it was something that came together very, very quickly. What I think is interesting, and one of the reasons I think this is something that's come together quickly, is the news reports have spoken that Alonso is in for 2021 with a possible extension for 22. And we'll see. And in the back of my mind, considering Renault's position at the moment, that doesn't quite add up for me. Alonso is a very, very shrewd guy. He's very, very clever, very experienced, and we all know that. And I can't help but think this is a guy who's thinking long term. And it would not surprise me in the slightest if he's got something backed up beyond 2022. And that's not necessarily driving. I would not be surprised if he has an actual position, another position in the team set and ready to go for him when he finally hangs up his F1 helmet in 2022.
That's it. And something I wanted to raise, actually. I thought it was very interesting that the deal is explicitly for 2021. There's kind of murmurs of 2022, but it's clearly not signed on paper. It's obviously only been spoken about. And you do wonder whether that's Fernando having something in his back pocket for the following year. I mean, Renault haven't exactly sparkled on their return to F1, and this is a chance for him to kind of walk away from it all if it does turn out to be a disaster. But it is quite interesting with the rhetoric in the press release and what he's talking about, how he wants to bring young drivers up, make this a role that's, beyond, what he does behind the wheel and what he can actually impart on. But is this a good deal for Renault? Is it a good deal for Fernando? I think it's a good deal for Fernando. I don't think Fernando's ever going to do a bad deal, really, on paper at least. But do you think this is a good deal for Renault? Do you think they're letting the driver perhaps take, get the big name driver in that they wanted to help them sell cars, etc., etc.? But is it really going to help them on track?
I think it's a good deal for Renault. Commercially, it's fantastic for Renault, for Formula One. I think there's a little bit of Liberty Media's hand on it, because they're thinking we might lose Kimi, we might lose Seb next year, we might have only Hamilton, only like the driver with the biggest number of wins in the whole series, but anyway, only one champion. And we might need a big name, and Fernando wanted to come back, so that everything came together. Is it good for Renault technically? Well, people who have worked with him said he's very good. He is, the information he gives for the engineers and the confidence, it's all very good. Technically, but there's a little bit of the relationship between him and the other side of the team, him and Cyril, which is something we have to talk about, because everybody thinks there's going to be a mess there. If he's Esteban's teammate, Esteban, he's not the easiest of the guys. So there's a lot of things to go wrong there with Renault publicly as well, because Cyril and Esteban and Fernando, they like this kind of, I don't know if you have this expression in English, but to make your laundry on TV, that's what we say, make it public, make your washing public.
Wash your dirty linen, so wash your dirty laundry in public, yeah. Yeah,
so the three of them, they like to do that. Renault is not in a very good position at the moment in terms of pace, if they're thinking about wins. Fernando, he caught my eye that he only mentioned podiums. But Fernando, it's quite weird. He goes back to Formula One because he wants to fight for podiums. That was quite weird. So Renault is in that position. If they're fighting for podiums, that's very good for them. And they are going to be in that position next year as well. There's not much they can do. So the only chance to turn around will be 22, but it's still a little bit too early, because of course 22 is good for them because the budget cap is closer to their budget than to Red Bull, to Ferrari, to Mercedes. They've got an advantage there, but that advantage would only play in 23, 24, or when they change the engine in 26. And Fernando won't take advantage of that. So that's what I'm struggling to understand. And maybe the point you made, that maybe he's not thinking only about driving. maybe that's what it's all about. Because driving-wise, I cannot see him benefiting from whatever steps he can bring to Renault.
It's interesting. I think there are some parallels between what Alonso is possibly doing next year to what we almost saw Alain Prost do with Ligier in 1992. Most people, if unaware, Prost actually, when he was after being fired by Ferrari at the end of '91, tested for Ligier in 1992, originally with the eye to drive that season with the French team and then possibly manage them later on. And I do think that's what's happening here. We also need to remember, it's only is it 3 or 4 years ago that Alonso tried to bring together his own cycling team to run and manage that as well. So I do think there's definitely management sites in Alonso long term. The relationship between him and Cyril, the relationship between everybody and Cyril at Abiteboul is it's really, really, really interesting.
Everybody and Fernando as well.
Yeah, I can't see them not clashing. And I think something that's been brought up in the last year or two as well is the long-term position of Cyril himself. How long is he going to be there? There's whole swaths of things happening in the Renault background, particularly on the Nissan side, and things are slowly shifting. I'm not necessarily convinced Cyril could be there in the F1 team in the long term. That's not to say that he will depart the Renault company, but I could definitely see some movement there. Renault as a whole, going into 2021, we've seen their engine has gotten better. Definitely, I mean, their engine got on the podium at the weekend, so it's, there clearly is something there. But there's still something very wrong in the chassis engineering structure of the team. They do seem to be struggling with their chassis. They've been struggling with the chassis for quite a while now. And I think that could be one of the elements that gets unearthed in all of this. I think there's still a lot of movement to happen in the Renault team. We've seen a lot already in the last few years, and actually a lot of change in the last year that maybe might come to fruition in 2022. But actually, one thing you did notice, you said Liberty, have they had a hand in the Alonso move? Is that just the most Bernie Ecclestone thing in the world? At a time when Liberty and F1 have effectively disowned the guy.
Yeah, they're trying to do everything differently, but some things, there's no way out. If they're going to have only one world champion, although Max has a huge following with him and Charles as well. It's still, there's a lot of people who have seen Formula One throughout the years, and then look at the grid, it's out, this bunch of boys and Lewis Hamilton. So you have to give something back to everybody, to the people who are coming in watching Formula One now because of the young guys, and the others who are used to have lots of champions on the grid.
Is it a strange situation where you possibly got Sebastian Vettel leaving F1 and got Fernando Alonso coming back in? It's like out with the old and in with the old. But we talk about Cyril Abiteboul there, and Fernando's reputation for being outspoken. I think it's probably the kindest way to put it. GP2 engine, GP2 engine, GP2 engine. Cyril thinks he, a year out of F1 is going to help kind of temper those feelings, and he'll be a bit more patient with Renault, because we look on paper with Renault and you can see there could be issues there for them not performing. And as you say, Julianne, that he mentioned podiums rather than wins, which seems like a bit down from what he would normally expect. So do you think Fernando is seeing this for what it is, or do you think when it comes to his media sessions, he's always good for a headline? Is he going to be able to help himself when it comes to looking at the bigger picture and to towing the party line?
Interestingly enough, as well, I mean, I saw an awful lot on social media about, what about the younger drivers, the guys they have in the Renault Driver Academy? And with all due respect to them, at this moment in time, if you were to give me the option between Fernando Alonso and a lot of the drivers in their young academy, I'm just going to go with Alonso now. Now, that's not to say that the drivers in the academy won't make it eventually. I think they've got some pretty solid drivers in there who need time, and they need time and they need maturity. You can't rush that. And Alonso, yeah, as you said, we know his attitude. Will he call things out at Renault if things are wrong? Yes. But that's just maybe what they actually need. And I think to really get things kicking, I think sometimes a lot of people call Alonso out in that, but a lot of drivers in the past have done that before as well. Like, Senna's done that, Schumacher did that, Lauda did that. The only difference is we didn't have Twitter in those days. We didn't have Facebook. We didn't have all the other forms of social media where fans and media going back and forth. So I think Alonso is playing the game that many other world champions have done before, but just in front of a far more vibrant media.
It's typical, isn't it? In the year that Carlos Sainz gets to move to Ferrari, be the big Spaniard on top, then Fernando Alonso still comes back and somehow steals his thunder with a different team. So, but they're great friends. I'm sure they'll be very happy to to be on track together. And I'm sure one person who'll be relishing this entirely is Esteban Ocon. Now, you mentioned there, Esteban's not the easiest teammate to get along with, as we've seen in the past, largely because he's very aggressive and he wants to win, and there's no iron team, and et cetera. But do you think he'll be relishing this prospect to go toe to toe with one of the greats in the same car? And do you think he'll be willing to roll over for what I assume will be a second driver role, even if it's not in reality?
Yeah, I was thinking today about Esteban, thinking about when Fernando came to Ferrari against Felipe. So Felipe in his view, was in a very good position at Ferrari because he had beaten Kimi in 2008. 2009, he was better than Kimi before the accident. And when he came back from the accident, he thought, okay, now I am Ferrari's #1 driver. I came from the academy. It wasn't the academy itself, but he was brought up in a way by Michael Schumacher. And then he paved his way in the team and thought, okay, now it's my team. And I remember he was telling me that in the second race, he realized, oh no, this team has completely turned around. This man came here and put a lot of pressure on everybody, and more than pressure, he delivers on track. So it's really hard for me to even be faster than him in a pre-practice. How can I go and shout to Domenicali at the time, say, oh, you need to treat me better? Because he puts pressure politically, but at the same time, he delivers on the track. So Esteban has a very, very tough situation to deal with. And in the past, he hasn't dealt well with situations like that. He is a guy who fought so hard in his whole career. We all know his history, not being privileged, his family just selling the house, selling everything to go and fund his racing. He's got this anger. That's what I feel when I talk to him. He's a very sweet guy. He's smiling at you, but he's got this anger that he's going to go there and make it. In a way, that's the way Fernando always dealt with his career in Formula One, remembering that when he arrived in Formula One, Spain in Formula One, Spain is for MotoGP, Spain is not for Formula One. And he had this kind of aggression on him. And Esteban has the same, but Esteban didn't do, when he had his chances in Formula One so far, as much as Fernando did. So he doesn't seem to be as talented as Fernando is. So that's why I think he's in a very, very difficult situation, because he's going to, what happened to Felipe going back in the story is that he realized, I'm going to be a second driver here. I'm going to make the best that I can, and I'm going to take all the opportunities. Because that's the kind of person Felipe is. He wanted to be a nice guy as well. He cares about other things. Esteban is not this guy. So with Esteban, I think there will be more trouble.
Like we said, can you imagine a driver literally walking into a garage and going, I'm #1 driver now, change this, that, the other. That's what I do. Just announce my presence. Now, we're going to get away from Alonso. He's next year's news. So obviously we're in the middle of 2 events. We wait months and months and possibly years, depending on how big your hair grows. I've kind of lost track. The 2020 season has started, finally, over the weekend in Austria. So no sooner we're done with round 1, we have round 2 in exactly the same place. We've had competitive results before, but it's literally Groundhog Day. So, if if you can replicate what we had last weekend, fantastic. And to be honest, it makes me long for the days of when high attrition, when cars used to break down, when 6 cars would finish about 10 laps apart from each other, but they got to the finish. It kind of makes me miss that. So I don't want to dwell too much on last week's race, but looking beyond the obvious people, who do you think are unsung heroes of the day? And they don't have to be the drivers themselves.
Well, I think for the second race, all this breaking down could still happen, because what Mercedes were telling us is that it's the problem. It's the circuit is the problem. It's not the problem they stayed away from racing for that long. The problem is that we are now in Australia. In Australia, it's so difficult to overtake that they just, after the pit stops, turn everything down and they go as a possession to the end of the race. In Austria, they cannot do that, and they have to attack the curbs, and they have chances to overtake, so they have to keep going. And that's why not all the cars, but half of them broke down last weekend. And this could happen this weekend as well. And they could be different cars, or maybe the Mercedes cars that had problems. We don't know the real extent of the problems. We never know with Mercedes what the real extent is, what is the drama. But it could happen. So it ended up being, I thought this race was going to be very dull. I thought the first one was going to be dull as well, especially with Mercedes having half a second advantage per lap. But it turned out to be a very good race in the end. So this one could be as well, with some talking points. Like Red Bull didn't finish with both cars. There's, of course, they need to take care of the reliability, but also the front wing. They don't know which front wing to choose, because both of them, Max had a new one and Alex had an old one. Both drivers were complaining about the same. The car seems to be very tricky to drive. It's not a slow car, of course, but it seems to be very nervous for both drivers, and they were with different configurations, so they had this homework to do. With Mercedes, of course, they had this electrical noise, whatever they're calling their problems, to also address. And Ferrari has everything to address. A little bit of updates coming this weekend, but maybe not for both cars. We don't know yet how this is going to pan out. So a lot of things could change. And another thing that I would like to remember is that now it's Valtteri who has the toe in qualifying. So it could be 2 wins for Valtteri if the toe does work this time, of course, in the first 2 races. That's something we could never expect.
You just imagine Lewis just like, oh, run wide at turn 4. Oh no. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to kind of delve into this weekend. I mean, is what we had at the weekend, is that an argument to make the curves more aggressive at other circuits, or do they need to be, shaven down to make sure they're not as aggressive? Is that the nature of the sport? Do Mercedes need to literally drive around the curves, drive around their issues, in order for them to, they can't, if they're going to have the fastest car, they've got to have a reliable car too. Sometimes one's going to lose out to gain the other. So do you think F1's going to stumble across a bit of a trick to actually make it more challenging for people?
It's a tricky one, because as we saw at Monza last year, I think it was in the Formula 3, I think it was one of the Formula 3 races or the Formula 3 qualifying, where one of the drivers actually kind of had a somersault over one of the sausage curbs that had been put in. So there is a lot of care and consideration taken into the kind of curbs that were used. Not forgetting, of course, in the build-up to the weekend, they did actually change the nature of the curbs, because there was worries that some of the teams did not have enough spares going into this round. And it really must explain that might sound ridiculous, because Australia was supposed to have been 4 months ago, but a lot of teams have effectively been shut down for quite a large portion of the year. So they're still actually working off a lot of the Melbourne spare parts, as it were. So they don't necessarily want to make the curbs too aggressive. Quite ominously, though, I think it was from Andrew Shevlin, mentioned just after the race weekend that they're already working on a fix on the curbing issue, and that next weekend's Styrian Grand Prix won't be an issue, which kind of point my heart kind of sank a little, to be frankly honest.
Well, if they can build a ventilator in 10 days, and I'm sure they can do something that will make the cars drive over curbs.
What I really thought was quite interesting about last weekend's Grand Prix is looking at the likes of McLaren and Racing Point, and I haven't slipped back into Force India yet, so 1 point for me. Is the difference between
You're actually called Toro Rosso, I think.
Oh yeah, them as well. Minardi. I thought it was very interesting the swings and roundabouts between those teams who seemed to lack who were expecting more in qualifying from McLaren, actually showed quite good, solid race pace come the Grand Prix itself and Racing Point, who were qualified maybe not as well as we thought they would have, but still much higher than they did last year, but actually not quite as potent in the actual race itself. That's obviously a big issue for both teams, because you don't want to qualify too far back, because that means you have to take on potential alternative strategies. You're going to have to overtake over people to get into the position you want to be. But you also don't want a slow race car, because what's the point in qualifying 4th and 5th if it means, I'm just checking here, Perez finished 6th and Stroll didn't finish at all, but he was running like 10th or 11th or something like that when he retired. What's the point in building a fast qualifying car if your race pace is off? So I think just McLaren and Racing Point, two teams who do look to be a step up from where they were last year, but still actually have concerns as they're going into each race. Ferrari, meanwhile,
We're journalists, and I just wanted to kind of get your take on what covering F1 was like from home. Because on the one hand, you can roll out of bed naked in your hands. You can watch FP1. Start at 8:59 with a coffee in hand. Great. But it's tempered with the fact that there are some journalists out there, and it's the sheer anxiety you get from your contemporaries being there and you're not. So, just how you found it working from home? Are you really, really missing it, or have you stumbled across something where you can just pretend you're there forever?
Well, for me, it was my first race at home since the race before the Spanish Grand Prix of 2016. So a long time. I didn't remember. It's the first time I covered an F1 race in the European time from home. In the Brazilian time is horrible to cover because the FP1 is at 5 a.m. So I was actually quite relaxed to wake up later than usually, what I would normally do to go to the track, and then FP1 and write my stories. Oh, I want to eat healthy. I've got my stuff to eat healthy, because we know that it's really hard to eat healthy when you are in a media center. Anything you have, just boom, boom, by the end of the weekend, you are this big. But yeah, that's the true life of a Formula One journalist. And I even took some advantage. Like I washed my hair, and I was doing my hair from one session to the other, thinking I could never do that in a Formula One race. So yeah, I tried to take advantage of everything I could. But it's really hard for people who are there. I didn't miss the fact that I wasn't there for this race, because the access is so bad. They cannot go to the paddock. And that's what I missed, just to go there and ask questions, speak to people, not press conferences, not the normal sessions that we are doing via Zoom or Microsoft Teams anyway. But the real journalism that we do, speaking to people, that's what I missed in this first race. And I felt a little bit detached from the race because I didn't have this kind of conversation. So that's going to be hard for the next few. I hope we're going to be back in the paddock in Silverstone. But from what I heard, because I'm really interested about that part, what I heard is that the FIA is taking really, really seriously this whole coronavirus matter. They don't want any infections on the grid whatsoever, in the Formula One paddock whatsoever throughout the whole year, which is going to be really tough. So we might have to work from home a little bit longer. I hope that's not the case, but if it's for everybody's health and safety, then that's it.
I like how you went in there saying you wanted to eat healthy, because we can't eat. It is really, really difficult to eat healthily at the track. Although, to be fair, we are normally nursing hangovers the next morning. You kind of missed that bit out where we work long hours, but God, we don't sleep many of them. It's not sober or nursing a hangover. But I was going to say, Lee, I found it a little bit bizarre this weekend where I was sat here in a Zoom call or a Teams meeting, and I'm got this background, or it's actually quite tidy at the moment. It's not normally that tidy. You've got an F1 driver, you've got Toto Wolff, you've got peering into your living room. In a way, you kind of feel quite privileged and far away at the same time.
Yeah, do you know what? This is going to sound very, very bizarre. I have missed going to the airport. You know, it's because it's not just F1. I do a lot of DTM. I cover a lot of sports cars and rallying as well. So I tend to be flying into like all completely random places, and I do really miss going to an airport. Jules made a really, really, really good point there. Actually, one of the best things about doing what we do is actually meeting the people there. You never do this from home. It's forming the relationships. It's sometimes, and it's not the press conferences. It's not the sit down interview you have with a driver. It's the other little things, like coming across a team boss outside a garage, and you might have a little aside that may only last 90 seconds, but you'll get more info in that 90 seconds than you would in a 5-10 minute interview. It's the relationships you build with physios. It's a relationship. Actually, some of the best relationships as a journalist I've ever made in covering motorsport is with engineers, because I have a huge, huge, huge list, a huge swath of drivers who will tell me that the tire pressures were off and the front wing wasn't right. That's why I went slow today. And I have a huge list, an even bigger list of engineers who will turn around to me and say, "No, the driver's shit." So it's those little intimate things that you get in the paddock that you cannot get from home. And again, it's nice. I think I've had so many Zoom and Skype meetings in the last several months, because I'm working on, we're nearly finished the second issue of World in Motorsport. So I've had Rubens Barrichello, Gerhard Berger, several of members of the WRC paddock, some of the members of the IndyCar paddock, having a very nice view of my kitchen.
It's a lovely kitchen.
And
it is a bit more of a personal.
It's going to be like that, and then I created my small studio. See, next time.
Well, normally I do have a framed picture of Silverstone that my girlfriend got me for my birthday a couple of years ago. That sits there. I was too lazy to get it out for you this evening.
This Silverstone signed it for you as well.
One of the other things, actually, it didn't quite mention though, is eating at the track is sometimes quite unhealthy. I think what's really different is, I think Ben Hunt tweeted it during the weekend as well. Ben Hunt from The Sun. It's very, very difficult to get back to your hotel before midnight for the most part at a Grand Prix weekend, and they are wonderful events, and I love covering them. But my word, that Monday morning is always a slog. It's that a little bit difficult, and you always end up eating dodgy pizza at like 11:30 at night, just before you kind of collapse. That is not necessarily the kind of the best, most healthiest way to kind of get by, but you know what? When it comes to covering sports, I wouldn't change it.
To be fair, even last weekend, I think I did exactly the same thing. So it might not even be, it might just be lazy, to be honest.
There was a reason why I insulted you just before we actually started recording, you know that.
Yeah, there's a reason why it's still come below here. Basically, lockdown's not been good for that waistline. Great place to end that on that bombshell. Thank you so much for joining me. So for this first one, so what will hopefully be a series, I hope you can join me again. I say to everyone out there watching this, like and subscribe, wherever it is, just whatever. Just keep coming to the site, keep coming to the YouTube channel. I don't know whose head I'm pointing at the moment. So like and subscribe.
Send lots of comments about Ollie's living room.
Yeah. It's actually not mine. I just hired it today. And get a green screen next time. Put it in, put anything I want on there. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully see you again soon. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's hope for another good one.